I never thought I'd be the kind of person who checks a rental app to see if his own house is listed on it. Then again, I never thought I'd get a voicemail from my HOA coordinator saying my neighbors had been complaining about strangers coming and going from my property for the past 2 months. My name is Owen Hartley. I'm 48 years old, a regional sales manager for a medical device company based out of Nashville, Tennessee. My territory covers 12 states across the Southeast and Midwest, which means I'm on planes and in rental cars roughly 3 weeks out of every month. It's the kind of job that sounds glamorous until you've eaten your 4th consecutive meal alone at a TGI Fridays off an interstate exit somewhere in rural Ohio. I've lived in my house on Sycamore Bend Drive for 9 years. 3-bedroom craftsman in a quiet neighborhood in Brentwood, about 20 miles south of downtown Nashville. I bought it back when I was still married, and after the divorce 6 years ago, I kept it because the mortgage was manageable and I liked the yard. My daughter visits on holidays. My dog died 2 years back and I never got another one. Most of the time when I'm home, I'm just passing through, doing laundry, repacking, grabbing a few hours of sleep before the next flight out. That was my life. Quiet, simple, functional, until the second Tuesday in March, when everything I thought I knew about the security of my own home turned out to be wrong. I was in the middle of a product demo in a conference room in Birmingham when my phone buzzed with a voicemail. I didn't listen to it until I got back to my hotel that evening. The message was from a woman named Sandra Okafor, the coordinator for the Sycamore Bend HOA. Her voice was professional but careful, the way people sound when they're trying not to alarm you, but also absolutely need to. Mr. This. Hartley, hi, this is Sandra calling from the Neighborhood Association. I'm sorry to bother you. I know you travel quite a bit. I wanted to let you know that a few residents on your street have raised some concerns. There's apparently been some foot traffic at your property, different people coming and going at odd hours. One of your neighbors, the gentleman across the street, thought you might have started renting out your place, but when I checked our short-term rental policy and didn't see any permits filed, I wanted to reach out before taking any further steps. Please give me a call when you get a chance. I listened to that message twice standing in the middle of a courtyard by Marriott in Birmingham, Alabama. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there for a while. I hadn't rented out my house. I hadn't given anyone a key. I hadn't told anyone other than my company's travel coordinator what my schedule looked like. The first thing I felt was confusion. The second was something cold and specific that I didn't have a name for yet. I called Sandra back immediately. She was still in the office. She told me that my neighbor across the street, a retired contractor named Frank, had noticed it about 6 weeks ago. Different cars in my driveway, people with rolling suitcases, lights on at hours they shouldn't have been. He'd assumed at first that maybe I had a friend house-sitting. Then a second neighbor mentioned seeing a woman she didn't recognize taking out my trash cans on collection day. That was when Sandra started paying attention. I told her the same thing I'd told myself. I hadn't authorized any of this. There was a pause on the line. Owen, I think you need to come home and figure out what's happening. I changed my return flight. What was supposed to be a Friday evening arrival became a Wednesday morning red-eye. I didn't sleep on the plane. I sat in the dark cabin at 30,000 feet running through explanations, each one worse than the last. I landed in Nashville at 6:40 in the morning. Instead of driving straight to Sycamore Bend, I went to a Starbucks 2 neighborhoods over and sat in my car. I needed to think before I acted. The rational part of my brain said, call the police, explain the situation, have them escort you home. But when I'd called the non-emergency line from Birmingham the night before, yes, I'd done that. Lying in a hotel bed at midnight, the officer I spoke with had been patient and not particularly encouraging. Sir, if there's no sign of forced entry and someone is claiming to have permission to be there, that puts it in civil territory initially, he said. What we'd suggest is getting documentation first. A clear record that unauthorized people are accessing your property without your consent. I understood the logic even though it frustrated me. So instead of driving directly home, I drove to a Best Buy when it opened at 9 and bought 2 wireless security cameras, a video doorbell, and a small tablet to use as a dedicated monitor. I also stopped at a hardware store and bought a motion-activated floodlight for the back. I set everything up that afternoon while I was confident the house was empty. I parked 3 blocks away and walked, which felt absurd, sneaking up on my own home on a Wednesday morning in a neighborhood where I'd mowed the lawn for 9 years. But I didn't know what I was dealing with, and I wasn't going to walk in blind. The house was empty when I let myself in through the back door. And the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was deeply wrong. The kitchen smelled like someone else's cooking. Not bad, actually, almost pleasant, something herby and warm, but completely unfamiliar. My kitchen, in my house, smelled like a stranger had been making dinner in it. I stood in the doorway and took stock. There were dishes in the drying rack that weren't mine, a coffee maker on the counter that I'd never owned, a nicer one than mine actually, an espresso in brushed silver. The recycling bin had wine bottles in it. I don't drink wine. I walked through the house slowly. In the living room, there were throw pillows on the couch that I didn't recognize. Soft, decorative things in shades of terracotta and cream. My couch is dark grey. The pillows look staged, like something from a hotel. On the coffee table, there was a small wicker basket containing individually wrapped chocolates and a folded card. I picked it up. The card read, "Welcome to the Hartley House. Wi-Fi, Sycamore Bend under Zalakay's password, Tennessee Rocks 22. Please help yourself to the snacks in the pantry. Checkout is 11 a.m. I had to read it 3 times before the words made sense. Someone had turned my house into a vacation rental. Someone had given my home a name. Someone had provided guests with access to my Wi-Fi, and stocked my pantry with their snacks and put decorative pillows on my couch and left a welcome basket on my coffee table like this was a business they were running. Because it was. That's exactly what it was. I set the camera up in the living room first, tucked behind a row of books on the built-in shelving. Second one in the kitchen, angled from above the refrigerator. The doorbell camera replaced my existing one, same mounting bracket, clean swap. Then I put the floodlight on the back of the garage. I didn't move anything else. I didn't touch the Nespresso machine or the decorative pillows or the welcome basket. I wanted whoever was running this operation to walk back in and think everything was exactly as they'd left it. Then I went to a Hampton Inn near the airport and I waited. I didn't have to wait long. At 3:20 that afternoon, the doorbell camera sent an alert to my phone. I opened the app and watched as a man, mid-40s, trim build, khaki pants, a fleece vest with what looked like a real estate company logo on the chest, walked up my front path with a set of keys in his hand. He moved with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times. He didn't look around. He didn't hesitate. He just unlocked my front door and walked inside. I watched through the indoor cameras as he did a walkthrough of the house. He went to each room methodically, straightening things, checking on something on his phone, adjusting the pillows on the couch, the decorative ones he put there, not mine. He opened the fridge and spent a few seconds looking at the contents, then added something he'd brought in a paper bag. He was restocking my refrigerator with food for guests. I recorded everything. Over the next 4 days, I documented his routine. He came by every afternoon, usually between 2 and 4. He let himself in, did a check, tidied up. On the first evening, a couple arrived with luggage, rolling bags, a tote that said Nashville or bust on it in block letters. They looked like tourists. They were tourists. They had no idea they were staying in a house that someone had stolen out from under its rightful owner. On the 3rd day, someone else showed up. A woman, maybe late 30s, driving a white Honda Pilot. She didn't have a key. She knocked, and the man in the fleece vest answered. They stood in my entryway for a moment, then she came inside. Through the living room camera, I watched them sit at my dining room table with a laptop. I zoomed in on the screen as much as the camera resolution allowed. I could make out what looked like a property management dashboard, rows of listings, calendar blocks, pricing. She turned the laptop slightly and I could see a column of what looked like addresses. My address was on that screen, but it wasn't the only one. I had her on camera for almost 2 hours. When she left, the man walked her out, and I caught part of their conversation on the doorbell audio. "The Hartley property's fully booked through the end of the month," she said. "I already pushed it out on all 4 platforms." "Good," he said. "Keep the nightly rate where it is. High season's coming." High season. He was talking about my home the way a hotel manager talks about occupancy rates. I spent that night researching. I searched my address on every short-term rental platform I could find. On Verbo, I found it listed as Cozy Craftsman near Nashville, 3BR, perfect for groups. The photos were of my living room, my kitchen, my backyard, my master bedroom. There were 62 reviews. 62. The oldest was dated almost 8 months ago. The average rating was 4.9 stars. I read through the reviews with something that felt like dissociation. People had slept in my bed and left 5-star reviews talking about how comfortable it was. Someone had hosted a bachelorette weekend in my house and called the host super responsive and accommodating. A family from Ohio had spent Thanksgiving at my dining room table and said it felt just like home. All of this had been happening for 8 months, the entire fall and most of the winter. While I was in hotel rooms in Omaha and Charlotte and St. Louis running sales demos, strangers were sleeping in my beds, cooking in my kitchen, sitting on my porch. I found the Airbnb listing next. Different photos, same property. A third listing on Furnished Finder targeted longer-term stays. She'd said all 4 platforms. I found the 4th on a site called Vacasa. 4 separate listings. 1 house. 8 months. I looked up the man in the fleece vest. The logo on his vest had been legible enough in the footage that I could make it out. Pinnacle Property Group. I searched the company. It was a small property management firm based in Brentwood, about 2 miles from my house. The website listed 3 employees, one of whom was named Todd Brewer, described as their short-term rental specialist. His photo matched the man on my cameras. The woman took longer to identify. The break came when Todd walked her to her car on the 3rd day, and I caught the Honda Pilot's rear plate clearly enough on the driveway camera. I wrote down the plate and called a friend of mine, a guy I went to college with who now works in insurance and knows how to run plates through a third-party lookup service. He called me back in an hour. The car was registered to a woman named Vanessa Odom. A quick search turned up a LinkedIn profile, marketing consultant, and vacation rental optimization specialist. Her website offered services including professional listing photography, SEO copywriting for rental platforms, and pricing strategy for short-term rental hosts. Those were my listing photos on her portfolio page. My living room, my kitchen, my backyard on her professional portfolio. The picture was getting clearer, but one piece was still missing. Todd Brewer had a key to my house. He'd had it for at least 8 months. He'd been managing it like a property he had authority over. But how? I went back through everything. I thought about who had access to my home. My daughter had a key. She'd had it for years, used it maybe twice. My housekeeper came every other week. I gave her a door code, not a physical key. And my property management company, Greenfield Home Watch, which I'd hired about 2 years ago specifically because I traveled so much. They checked on the house every 10 days or so, handled any maintenance calls, held a spare key in their lockbox. I called Greenfield. I asked to speak with the owner, a woman named Barbara. I told her I had a security concern and asked whether anyone outside the company had ever been given access to my property. There was a silence on the line that told me everything before she said a single word. "Owen," she said carefully, "what kind of access are you referring to?" I told her about the cameras, about Todd Brewer, about 8 months of rental listings. Another silence. Then I need to make some calls. I'll call you back within the hour. She didn't call back within the hour. She didn't call back within the hour. She called back in 40 minutes, and her voice had changed completely. She told me that one of her part-time employees, a man who'd been with Greenfield for about 14 months, had been placed with the company through a staffing agency. His name was Kevin Marsh. He was one of the people who did the property walkthroughs. He had access to the key lockbox. He was also, it turned out, Todd Brewer's brother-in-law. Kevin Marsh had been providing Todd with key copies and homeowner schedules for an unknown number of properties on Greenfield's roster. Barbara didn't know how many. She didn't know how long. She only knew that Kevin had resigned 2 weeks ago with no notice, and she'd assumed it was just a personal situation. She hadn't investigated. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I drove to the Nashville Metro Police Department's West Precinct and asked to speak with someone in the property crimes unit. The detective I was assigned was a methodical man in his late 40s named Earl Vickers. He listened to my entire story without interrupting, made careful notes, and asked to see the footage on my tablet. He watched for 20 minutes before he looked up. "Mr. Burr, hardly. This is wire fraud, criminal trespass, theft of services, and potentially conspiracy depending on how many properties are involved," he said. "You've done excellent documentation work. This is going to help us significantly." I told him about the address list I'd seen on Vanessa's laptop, the 4 platforms comment. I told him about Kevin Marsh and Greenfield Home Watch. I told him I believed there were other properties. I just didn't know how many. Detective Vickers assigned 2 additional investigators to the case. Over the following 2 weeks, they worked with Greenfield to identify every property Kevin Marsh had accessed during his employment. They cross-referenced those addresses against short-term rental listings. They found 7 properties, all owned by people who traveled frequently, all managed in whole or in part through Greenfield Home Watch, all listed on at least 2 platforms, some on all 4. The operation had been running for 14 months, the entire time Kevin Marsh had worked for Greenfield. Total revenue across all 7 properties, just under $119,000. My share was approximately $31,000. In 14 months, while I was on the road working, someone had made $31,000 renting out my home without my knowledge or consent. They'd used my utility infrastructure, my appliances, my furniture, my yard. They'd hosted over 100 guests in my house. The sting happened on a Friday afternoon in April. By then, Detective Vickers had enough to move. Officers waited until Todd Brewer and Vanessa Odom were both confirmed to be at one of the listed properties. Not mine, as it turned out, but a house in Germantown belonging to a nurse who traveled for contract work. There was a guest checking in when the police knocked. They arrested Todd Brewer on the spot. Vanessa Odom was taken into custody at her home office an hour later. Kevin Marsh was arrested the same day at his apartment in Antioch. I wasn't there for the arrests. Detective Vickers called me when it was done, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Publix in Birmingham. I was back on the road by then, because you don't stop working just because your life has fallen apart, and felt something that was almost but not quite relief. The charges: Todd Brewer faced criminal trespass, theft of services, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Vanessa Odom was charged with fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Kevin Marsh faced breach of fiduciary duty, criminal trespass, theft, and conspiracy. Because the operation crossed state lines, guests had been booked from multiple states. Payment processed through platforms headquartered out of state. Federal wire fraud charges were eventually added for all 3. The trial took place the following fall. I had to fly back to Nashville twice to testify. The footage from my cameras was central to the prosecution's case. Todd Brewer's attorney tried to argue that his client had believed in good faith that he had authorization to manage the properties, a claim that fell apart the moment the prosecutor played the audio clip of Todd saying, "The owner has no idea while standing in my driveway." Todd Brewer received 3 years in federal prison, 3 years supervised release, and was ordered to pay restitution. Vanessa Odom received 18 months and substantial financial penalties. Kevin Marsh, who cooperated fully from the moment of his arrest, received a suspended sentence, probation, and restitution. My share of the restitution came to roughly $28,000 once the courts finished calculating damages. It covered most of the direct financial harm, the utility bills, the locksmith, the professional cleaning service I hired to go through the entire house, the security system I installed. It didn't cover what I paid a therapist to help me stop lying awake imagining the 100+ strangers who had slept in my home, eaten in my kitchen, used my shower, sat on my porch at night. You can't put a dollar figure on that part. The other 6 homeowners had their own reckonings. One of them, a woman who did travel nursing assignments and was away even more than I was, discovered that a guest had gone through her filing cabinet and made copies of documents that included her social security number. She spent months dealing with the aftermath of that. Another couple found that someone had damaged a wall in the basement, and the damage had been poorly patched over, something Todd had apparently arranged to conceal from the homeowners. Greenfield Home Watch settled a civil lawsuit brought by 6 of the 7 victims. Barbara, to her credit, cooperated fully with the investigation and didn't try to minimize the company's role in enabling the breach. She still maintains she didn't know. I believe her. That doesn't make it better. I didn't sell the house. I thought about it. For a while, every room held a different intrusion. The Nespresso machine where mine hadn't been, the welcome basket on the coffee table, the stranger's shoes that had crossed my threshold over and over for more than a year. But I'd lived on Sycamore Bend for 9 years. My daughter knew that house. I wasn't willing to let Todd Brewer and his operation take that from me too. What I did instead, I installed a full smart home security system with professional monitoring. I changed every lock and switched to keypad entry with rotating codes. I terminated my relationship with Greenfield Home Watch and spent 2 months vetting their replacement. I set up utility alerts so that any spike above 15% of my baseline triggers a notification to my phone. I gave my neighbor Frank my direct cell number and told him explicitly, if anything ever seems off, call me first, not the HOA. Frank told me he'd suspected something was wrong months before he mentioned it to Sandra. He hadn't wanted to overstep, didn't know if maybe I'd started renting the place out intentionally. I told him I wished he'd called me the first week. We're closer now than we've been in 9 years of being neighbors, which is one of the stranger side effects of all this. I still travel 30 weeks a year. I still eat a lot of airport food and sleep in a lot of hotel rooms and drive a lot of rental cars through parts of the country that all start to look the same after a while. But now I check my home's camera feeds every morning before I check my work email. I have motion alerts on every door and window. I check my property against short-term rental platforms every 60 days, a calendar reminder, same as my dentist appointment. It seems excessive probably, to people who haven't had strangers sleeping in their beds for 14 months without their knowledge. Here's what I learned. In the plainest terms I can manage, if you travel frequently and own a home, install cameras, not because you expect something to go wrong, but because the cameras are the only thing that gave me the ability to prove what was happening. Without that footage, I'd have had an accusation. With it, I had a case. Monitor your utilities. Not obsessively, but regularly. A sudden, unexplained spike in electricity or water usage is information. In my situation, the sign was there. I just wasn't watching closely enough to see it until Sandra called me. Know your neighbors. Frank knew something was off 6 weeks before it came to light. That 6 weeks mattered. Build the kind of relationship with at least one neighbor where they feel comfortable calling you directly about something unusual, not routing it through an association coordinator. If you use a property management service, understand who has access to your home and what the oversight structure looks like. Ask what happens when an employee leaves. Ask who has keys and how those keys are accounted for. These are not rude questions. They are basic ones, and any reputable company should be able to answer them clearly. Search your address on Airbnb, Verbo, and Furnished Finder right now if you want. It takes 3 minutes. I had 62 reviews on Verbo before I discovered any of this. 62 people had stayed in my home. I had not the faintest idea. And finally, if something feels wrong, act. Don't rationalize. Don't wait for more evidence before you make the first call. I called the police non-emergency line from a hotel room in Birmingham, and it set everything in motion. That call, made at midnight while I was exhausted and uncertain, was the beginning of the end for Todd Brewer's operation. Make the call. The last thing I'll say is this. Home is not just a building. I know that sounds like something you'd read on a decorative sign at a TJ Maxx, but I mean it in a specific and serious way. Home is the one place on earth where you're supposed to be able to let your guard down entirely, where you don't have to perform or present or be on, where you can leave your shoes in the wrong place and your dishes in the drying rack and your books stacked in the wrong order, and it doesn't matter, because it's yours and no one's looking. What Todd Brewer took from me wasn't just revenue or utility money, or the comfort of knowing my belongings were undisturbed. He took that feeling, the one where you walk through your front door and your whole body unclenches because you're finally home. I've gotten most of it back. It took longer than the trial, longer than the restitution, longer than the new locks and the new cameras and the new neighbor relationship and all the visible, measurable changes I made. It came back slowly, in ordinary moments, making coffee in the morning, sitting on the porch in the evening, watching the neighborhood quiet down at dusk. It came back, but it took work, and it should never have been necessary in the first place. What gets me, even now, is the welcome basket, not the 62 Verbo reviews, not the $31,000, not even Kevin handing over my key to his brother-in-law like it was something that belonged to him to give. What I keep coming back to is that small wicker basket sitting on my coffee table with the folded card that said "Welcome to the Hartley House." Someone had named my home. Someone had decided what it was worth, who got to enter it. And I was the last person in the world who knew. I've thought a lot about the sequence of choices that made this possible. Todd Brewer didn't wake up one morning and accidentally commit 14 months of fraud. He made a calculation, probably an easy one. Find someone inside a property management company, offer them a cut, identify homeowners who are away enough that they won't notice. The plan worked because it targeted a specific kind of blindness, the assumption that if you've paid someone to watch over your home, the watching is actually happening. I had that assumption. It cost me. There's a version of this story where I stay angry at Todd, at Vanessa, at Kevin, and I stop there. They were dishonest people who did a dishonest thing, and they got caught, and that's the end. But that framing lets me off the hook for my own part in it. The part where I traveled 30 weeks a year and checked my camera feeds exactly 0 times, never looked up my address on a rental platform, never asked Barbara at Greenfield what her oversight structure looked like for employees with key access. I'm not saying what happened was my fault. It wasn't. But there's a difference between fault and responsibility, and I've had to sit with the latter. The intelligence required to protect yourself isn't complicated. It's mostly just attention, directed, consistent, applied to the things that matter. I knew how to close a sales deal across 12 states. I didn't know what my utility baseline was. I knew my quarterly numbers down to the decimal. I didn't know my neighbor Frank's phone number. That imbalance wasn't random. I built a life organized around professional performance and personal neglect, and someone found the gap and walked right through it. What pulled me out of the worst of it, the insomnia, the compulsive checking, the feeling that nowhere was actually safe, wasn't the restitution or the sentencing. It was deciding to act instead of just react, installing the cameras, driving to the police precinct with a folder of printed screenshots, sitting across from Detective Vickers and saying, "Here is what happened and here is the evidence." There's something that happens in you when you stop waiting for the situation to resolve itself and choose, deliberately, to be the person who resolves it. It doesn't fix everything, but it gives you back the sense that you have some agency in your own life, that you are not just a property to be managed by whoever has access to your keys. Todd Brewer is serving his sentence. Kevin Marsh is on probation. Vanessa Odom paid her fines. I'm still on Sycamore Bend Drive. I still check the cameras every morning. I still know Frank's number by heart. The basket is gone. The house is mine again. That's enough.